Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to Season 3 of the Agile World, where we discuss customer and employee experience, organizational and workforce transformation, and how business can adapt and continually improve in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed in this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles, or get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. Even though many organizations have embraced agile methods in their technology and other areas, they're still researching, trying, and buying using older, often outdated means. Today we're going to talk about evaluating software using more agile practices. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Phil Strazulla, founder of SelectSoftware Reviews. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me.
So why don't you start by giving a little background on your career, kind of what got you here, as well as what you do at SelectSoftware Reviews?
Sure. So I started my career off in venture capital, doing early stage software investing into SaaS and consumer internet companies. I always wanted to start a company, and so I went to business school and taught myself how to program while I was there. I started hacking on a bunch of different projects, one of which turned into an HR software business that about 2.5 years ago, I hired somebody to run as a general manager, taking myself out of the day-to-day. And so I had all this free time for the first time in a long time. I still had the desire to start another company, and I personally love to learn. I love to teach what I've learned, and saw this gap in the market where a lot of HR teams are really struggling with what technologies they should be purchasing, because there are so many different technologies, for something as boring as payroll to something maybe a little bit more interesting, like using artificial intelligence to hire engineering talent. And so I started SelectSoftware Reviews, and basically what we do is just spend a ton of time understanding the HR tech landscape. We write up our findings into what we think are tactical, unbiased content on our site, and it's totally free. We make our money through advertising with different vendors, and so we don't charge a subscription or anything like that. We also have a community. If you've got like a super bespoke question, we get all kinds of fun things from janitorial staffing companies in South Carolina that need specific types of workforce management, to you name it. And so that's kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis, and about 50,000 companies a month use our research to figure out which HR solutions they should be buying.
Well, let's kind of dive into the main topic here, and just how would you define what the challenges are in reviewing software, by companies?
So I think there's a lot. First,
Yeah.
I think most companies don't even know like where they should be focusing. If you think about HR, they've got this full employee life cycle from the first time somebody hears about your company all the way through the hiring process, onboarding, working at the company, becoming an alumni, etc. And there are hundreds of discrete kind of steps in that journey. Guy I talked to a few weeks ago actually mapped it out for his business, and just in the recruiting process, there were 270 discrete steps. And so there are tools that can help you with basically each of those.
Wow.
And there are probably 100 or 200 vendors for each tool category. And so it's a little bit overwhelming. And so I think that the first thing that companies really need to do is figure out, where do we want to focus our time and resources? Because we can only really do like one or two changes in a quarter or in a given kind of planning period. And so I always recommend, think about things in a business perspective, what's going to make the most impact. That's a really good place to start. Another good place to start is honestly just trusting your gut, because like you've been taking in data all day long from your colleagues, from what's happening in the business, etc. And chances are that like at a subconscious level what you should be doing, and once you kind of write that down, you should just on a conscious level rationalize it through a business case with an ROI that your CFO is going to appreciate. And then really think about things in an agile way. Like, how do we do an MVP here? What are the sort of key hypotheses we're trying to test to see if this is going to be successful? And how do we then scale what's working, change what's not, and continuously collect the data that we need to make the right decisions and evolve our process.
So what is that? I know you briefly touched on it, but how does a company get started in an agile software review process? Given, I mean, it sounds like in a lot of cases there's not a lot of process to even software reviews, and at least in some places. But how do they change any existing processes to move to an agile approach?
So what's really awesome is that most enterprise software companies have moved to a product-led growth strategy in the past couple of years. And there were a couple of companies I think were pioneers here, like Dropbox, where you had individual employees who were downloading Dropbox and sharing files internally. And all of a sudden, Dropbox, which was this consumer thing, was like, oh wow, we can sell like enterprise licenses. And it's really effective to sell to a company that already uses your product. And other companies saw that and said, hey, let's do more free trials, let's do more freemium sort of offerings. And that allows the adopters of that technology to, in a lightweight way, experiment and understand if something is the right solution for you or not, yeah, with the right KPIs in place, with the right process in place. I personally think that that's a really awesome trend that people can take advantage of. I think from like an internal perspective, you want to have somebody who is a champion, who's passionate about a project, who has the resources, the know-how to sort of spearhead something. And they're basically the CEO of that project. And then you want to kind of have like a board of advisors for that project as well, which is probably like that person's boss and maybe one or two other key stakeholders who are just sort of there to help and to get feedback and to give feedback. And that structure seems to work really well. It obviously, there's a reason that so many corporations use that structure. It's because, capitalism sort of like weeds out companies that try different things and kills them. And the best ones survive, and they all kind of follow the same operating structure. And I find that even as a small team, that's a great way because you get somebody with skin in the game who cares, and then you've got oversight as well. And so that would be sort of at a baseline how I would structure your team to go out and do this.
Yeah. How would you recommend that people position the benefits of this approach over the more traditional way of doing things?
Yeah, I mean, the more traditional way of doing things is like, let's do an RFP process. Let's talk to 10 vendors and evaluate them in this like very stodgy way that takes a long time. Let's select a vendor, sign a multi-year contract that we're locked into, and then implement software and hope that it goes well. And that just has a ton of risk because you're locked in, you're deploying a lot of capital, you're spending also a lot of time up front to vet these vendors in a way that isn't as real as actually utilizing the product. And as we all know, sometimes we have these ideas and then when we actually start to execute on the ideas, it's like, oh wait, this strategy actually doesn't make as much sense as I previously thought, or oh, there's this detail that's really, really important that I hadn't thought of until I started actually doing something. And that can lead you to select the wrong vendor. And by the time you realize that this is the wrong vendor, you're in a 3-year contract with SAP that costs a ton of money that you're never going to get out of. And it's going to take you 6 months to implement the software in the first place. So I think that the agile approach, if your company can do it, is 100 times better. It's de-risked and will almost certainly lead to better outcomes.
It sounds like there's two components to it. I mean, one is being more agile and able to adapt if the exact software that you're evaluating, let's say you're evaluating between 2 or 3 different platforms or something like that. There's that component of just maintaining agility there so you don't lock yourself into something before you get too far down a path. But it also seems like even before that, maybe during, but even before that, the requirements phase. I mean, in my experience, a lot of people go into things with some pretty strong assumptions that may or may not end up being right, and it seems like the traditional enterprise software sales process is, once you get so far down a path, you don't back up and say, hey, wait, what's the problem we're actually trying to solve? Is this, are we even buying the right type of software, or did we get the acronyms wrong, or something like that? How would you say, how can companies start in that requirements gathering phase and do a better job of not getting into that kind of trap?
I think you need to think about not just a form RFP that you've used previously or you find on the internet, but actually like what you care about for the solution from a first principles perspective and why this is important to you. And part of that is going to the business case and actually probably opening a spreadsheet up and saying, hey, like we want to implement this to change XYZ process and hopefully get ABC outcome. And therefore, these are the things that matter to us. These are the things that are icing on the cake that we read about or that we hope is available in the marketplace. And then doing a great job of being objective when you're going out and evaluating vendors. I think many times people are afraid. They don't want to get fired. They
Right.
don't want to buy the wrong solution. And so they create this 200 list feature requirement, and those can optimize for the wrong vendors. There are vendors that are really, really good at filling those things out, and they tend to be the big kind of more stodgy enterprise software guys that really optimize around what the CIO, CFO care about versus the end user. And so you sometimes get suboptimal engagement, uptake, and ROI from the actual solution. And so I would try as hard as you can to think from a first principles perspective about how you want to do this versus just using the tools that somebody else has used previously, because that's going to end up optimizing for the stuff that actually matters for the end users and thus the business value.
Yeah, and I think you're kind of touching on an interesting point I've thought about recently as well, is when the process of building requirements and understanding what you actually need changes and is more um, more specific to the organization. Do you think that democratizes the playing field? So in other words, the old saying, like, nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM, or
Yeah.
whatever. Do you think that gives kind of the smaller one, the smaller upstart platforms? Do you think it gives them a better fighting chance when when the requirements are closer to actual needs and value and things like that?
Right now, companies can select these sort of growth stage vendors who have gotten to maybe $4, 5, $6 million of revenue and therefore are de-risked from a gonna go bankrupt perspective. But also, you get the benefits of working with a startup. They've got new tech. It's built for the sort of modern age. You can influence the product if you're loud enough for with the customer success and product teams, even your sales and account management teams. And so you're getting this great product, but you're still kind of getting a lot of the I'm not going to get fired
Yeah.
things that you would with going through a legacy vendor.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think that I'm not going to get fired thing is certainly it's a component. And I mean, whether you're an individual, whether you're an employee, somewhat further down the org chart, or even a leader, making a multi-million-dollar investment in something. I mean, it sticks with you. Do you have any other advice for someone that wants to do what they believe is the right thing by bringing in perhaps even a non-traditional choice to a software, even a consideration set, but does have those concerns?
I think that as long as you're doing your research and your process is really solid, it's going to de-risk a negative outcome. So if you go to the powers that be, your CFO, CEO, whatever, and you say, hey, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's the research I've done, here's why I think this vendor is interesting, and you lay it out in a super thoughtful way that has the business case that compares things in a rational manner. If you somehow like this company goes bankrupt or like the unforeseen happens, that 1% chance hits, you get really unlucky, you're going to be super de-risked from your career perspective because you've done all the right things from a for the process. And when things go well, you're going to look like a rock star because it's like, hey, I have a really good process for this stuff. You're going to evangelize it internally. It's going to give you the internal juice to go off and do your next project with a lot less internal friction and get good results again, which leads to a nice virtuous cycle of just sort of doing these projects, getting them bigger and bigger results, more evangelization, etc.
Well, one last question before we wrap up. So you've been involved in the HR tech space in several different ways throughout your career. You know, investor, entrepreneur, part of teams and everything. I would imagine you've seen a lot of trends and things like that, and in that time, what are you seeing right now that should be top of mind to people that are considering anything in the HR tech space?
There's a lot of really interesting trends. So there's a lot of sort of employee experience technology that is becoming more important in a remote work world where companies are confronting more distributed teams that are more stressed out, a lot of mental health issues. So there's employee recognition programs that are really doing well, employee mental health programs that, there's like 4 unicorns in that space alone in the last 12 months, which is kind of crazy. There's the proliferation of artificial intelligence to help screen candidates, to reach out to candidates, to onboard people, to really do a lot of different things that traditionally you have to have a body deployed to do. And so now you can free that person up whose job it was to schedule people, and you can say, hey, we need you to do more strategic sourcing of engineering talent or whatever the case may be. So, the HR tech space is interesting. There's a lot of legacy technology, but it's changing really quickly, and companies that are adopting are reaping the benefits.
Phil, thanks so much for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Sure. So if you're interested in HR tech, SelectSoftware Reviews is our website where we do all this research. We have a community. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Phil Strazulla, with 2 Z's and 2 L's, pretty easy to find. And I also have a blog if you're interested in learning mostly about investing. I've been investing since I was 12, and I write a lot about all the different things that I do.
Well, again, I'd like to thank Phil Strazulla, founder of SelectSoftware Reviews, for joining the show. Thanks again for listening to The Agile World with Greg Kihlstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, from my website at theagile.world.